Okay, in this unity, we want to focus on election 2020. Now, for me, I was an English student at Wuhan University. You went to Wuhan. I have American teacher in my class. We learned American language, American culture, and so one of the things I learned, even after I moved to New Mexico for 30-some years, it's always telling the truth. It's like American character. I mean, American law, American conversation. You need to be transparent. Honesty is the best policy. But look at what happened in election 2020. To me, it looks like all levels of government or the legislature and the religious community, it's all failing. Not even people ignored the truth, but also canceling telling the truth. So to me, it's like a shock. And I became U.S. citizen last year.
Yes, congratulations. Welcome.
Year 2020.
But this is New Mexico, so bienvenidos.
Okay. So to me, it's like, this is very incredible after my walk and my pursuing, so-called American dream. Now, I don't have American dream, I have a kingdom dream, but it's like a shock to me. Mm-hmm. So how do you see that? America and Americans drastically moved away from its original root. How do you see, how did America come to this point?
Okay. So first of all, 2020 was not a surprise to me. When we look at the world from a biblical worldview, and we look at all the competing worldviews, the number one competing worldview is the naturalistic worldview. Okay, naturalistic worldview is an idolatry. Basically says that God doesn't exist, and so any worldview that rejects God, okay, for who He is idolatrous. And that, in the Old Testament, we've got Baal and Asherah, and we got different idols, and those are idols that you can see. But the Bible also addresses idols of the mind. And naturalism is one of those idols of the mind. You can't see it, but it is a deeply held system that understands the world in a certain way. And the foundational point of that is that God does not exist. Well, that has been taught naturalism has been taught in American universities. We're coming up to 150 years now, and incrementally, piece by piece, bite by bite, faculty member by faculty member, the people that held to the biblical worldview were pushed aside, and then the people that held the naturalistic worldview, they basically got teaching positions and administration positions at the university. Well, then the people that graduated from those universities, they too had a biblical worldview, or they too had a naturalistic worldview, and even Christians that attended, that they tried to bring together a naturalistic worldview and a biblical worldview, inside themselves. And so when they go out into the world, whether they go into politics or whether they go, into medicine or whatever the discipline is, business, technology, that they brought that naturalistic worldview into all these different categories and areas and domains of Hollywood and just all over. And so the naturalistic worldview has been growing like a cancer in American society. And so what happened is in the 2020 election, that was the election to where it was not necessarily about Donald Trump and Joe Biden. It was the battles of principalities and powers of these two forces that are inside the American culture. And there are some people that are completely sold out on a naturalistic worldview. Others are sold out on a biblical worldview. There's others that are in the middle that are trying to mix it and blend it and make peace with it. And as our good friend Chuck Colson, you're a Centurion, I'm a Centurion, we both studied under Chuck Colson, Chuck would say that politics is downstream from culture. And so what we saw in politics, what was present in the culture for decades. And so all of that finally flowed into the politics, and it showed up at the polls, and you had this massive battle between those that hold these two different worldviews. One is a naturalistic worldview, and the other is the biblical worldview. That was the clash of the titans in the 2020 election. And so in a naturalistic worldview, because God does not exist, and even though God vocabulary is used, but the biblical God, just because you say God over a bad program doesn't make that a Christian program. The same thing that happened in 1933 in Germany, that the people with the naturalistic worldview, they supported socialism, they supported a lower quality of life for some humans. Some human life was worth living, some human life was not worth living. When they made that decision, that the human life that was not worth living, that we were going to help evolution along, and we're going to begin to erase those people that are not helping evolution move forward. In 2020, we're basically, only 87 years behind what took place with the same worldview in Germany, and even before that in Russia, which resulted in the Soviet Union. Now, in China, the communist methodology is based on a naturalistic worldview, and doesn't believe in God, that government is the final authority in the life of the human being. And so China has borrowed from these European philosophers to create a communist economic and government system, but it's overlaid with Chinese characteristics. We hear that from Deng Xiaoping, we hear that from Hu Jintao, we hear that from Xi Jinping. The philosophy of Hegel, the philosophy of Marx and others, that was embraced. That's European philosophy. And that would have two of the white devils that the Chinese should have pushed out of China. Those European worldviews that are very, very damaging. But so in the election, that if human life doesn't have any value, well, truth then doesn't have any value. So we saw a lot of the deception that you talked about. We saw fraud at the polls. We saw the law being broken. We saw the law being changed, but not changed legally. And so this has all been coming. And anybody that had their eyes open, that we could see that for more than 100 years it's moving in this direction. Well, this kind of like started in the 1960s. It started long before that.
So do you think 2022, 2024, we didn't see in the news, we don't see in all kinds of activities among the churches and Christian communities? Now, how do people get the biblical worldview message and really work on the family, the community, the legislature? Do you see any hope?
I see hope, because I think that people who did not understand biblical worldview before, because everything was all peaceful, now that there's a storm, people are waking up and they're going, what's going on? And the biggest mistake that Christians could make is to think that this battle is between Democrat and Republicans. It manifests itself in political parties that way, but the battle is between the naturalistic worldview and the biblical worldview, because there are people inside the Republican Party that hold a naturalistic worldview, and they want lower taxes and smaller government and all these things, but they don't have a basis for what they're saying. And then you've got, there's still some people in the Democrat Party that still hold to a biblical worldview, and they're trying to transform the party from the inside. So this is not about Democrat or Republican. This is about whether people recognize that there's a transcendent God. He spoke the creation into being. He sustains the creation. He came in Jesus to redeem the creation, and he's coming back, and he's going to hold all government leaders accountable for what they do. and how they treat human beings. And so Christians, that we've got the good news, we've got the answer, but all too often it's come out in a very muddled way, and it becomes more about my personal experience with Jesus. You know, again, as I said before, Jesus in my heart, nothing in my head, as opposed to advancing the claim that Jesus is Lord over all reality, the creator, the sustainer, the redeemer, the consummator of the universe. And that's good news, because when people live their lives and they're following Christ, the society doesn't become perfect, but it's those societies that has had the highest value for human beings, and we see the highest thriving for human beings in those societies that embrace Christ.
You know, a lot of people right now either concerned or planning for 2022 or 2024. There's still a lot of either preparation or hope or battling about next election. So as far as you said, it's not a party. Manifested as a party struggle, right? But actually, it is more of a biblical worldview and a nationalist worldview, a battle. So how do you see that people can really get prepared? You travel to 16 states, you train people, and I heard from you, many churches waking up at that time. Many pastors began realize. My question is that it is all, you went to Coastal Center Centurion program, I went to Coastal Center because of you and learned the Centurion program. Do you see the Centurion program or Coastal Center or biblical worldview still expanding, still making difference, still helping a lot of churches and pastors grounded in biblical worldview and changing their school board, changing their community? How do you see that?
Right. So there's about 2,000 people that have graduated from the Centurion program. It's called COSN Fellows now, for any of our viewers that might look that up on the internet. And those are men and women from all walks of life, you know, nurses, doctors, teachers. And Chuck Colson, he understood, actually 3 people that were very influential, that listening to Chuck in terms of quoting, that, you know, number 1 was William Wilberforce, because William Wilberforce, he was the one that brought about the end of slavery in the British Empire. And he didn't believe in a separation of church and state. He didn't believe in the separation of faith and reason, that our commitment to Christ was a commitment to his creation as well, and the dignity of the human being that's made in his image and likeness. And so Wilberforce fought, and, you know, to end slavery. C.S. Lewis was another favorite of Chuck's, and also Francis Schaeffer. And so what we see is that Chuck saw forward, and he said that if there's going to be a change among God's people, there had to be something other than what was going on in local congregations for Christians to be grounded in a biblical worldview. And how can you proclaim Christ from the discipline? Are you a writer? Are you, whatever you do, you need to be looking at that and practicing from a biblical worldview and sharing the biblical world and expanding the biblical worldview. That's part of why we did some of the relief work in the earthquake zone in China. And see, work in the earthquake zone or any other type of charitable work like that, that work is the result of a biblical worldview. It's the foundation upon which the good works rest. If you pull the foundation out, there's nothing for the good works, you know, to rest upon. And so the hope is in the church recapturing a biblical worldview. And so now that 2020 has happened in the elections, many Christians are going, whoa. And my caution to them and my warning to them is that it's not about saving America, okay? It's about living for Jesus in the totality of all the work we do, and the result will be saving America. If we make saving America the main goal, then we're missing it, because it was the loss of a biblical worldview that allowed the naturalistic worldview into public education, into university education, and we're even seeing it now in Bible-believing evangelical churches in what's referred to as the social justice movement. See, the social justice movement, you and I and others that have examined it carefully, it looks at the evils in society, and then they respond with a Marxist response, but they use biblical terminology. The end of the day, it is still a Marxist, it's idolatrous, it's a Marxist approach. And so now we have inside Bible-believing churches confused individuals that want to take some of the teachings of Jesus and some of the teachings of Karl Marx, put them together, and that's going to save society. What's going to happen is it moves down the road, the Marxists are going to win, and the Christians will go to the concentration camp, similar to Martin Niemöller in Germany in the 1930s. And so there is hope, and the only hope is to bring biblical worldview back into the church, and for Christians to understand that Jesus is Lord over every domain of reality.
So my question to you to follow on that is that if we, as Chinese Christian community or Chinese churches or through this program, would ask you or Coastal Center saying, help us to establish a Chinese biblical worldview program, would you be willing to help us?
I have them call you. No, in fact, you're one of our success stories. It's important, yes, for to call me or to call you. And you and I have always been very good at putting people and connecting people where they need to be so the kingdom can move forward. And I would say yes, go ahead and call either.
Yeah, I would like to also work with you to connect with the Coastal Center. Maybe we have extension program for Chinese Centurion program.
Absolutely.
Something like that. My last question to you is, look at the election 2020. This is not the United States we see. This is a divided states we see. As Jesus says, a house divided will not stand. I mean, so many people come to America, so many people admire America from Asia, from the world. Now they're shocked. They're saying, if America used to be a shining city on the hill, it looks like no more. I mean, people get discouraged and depressed, and what people can do. I mean, I learned from you and I listened very carefully to your conversation that for all these 20 years, you are not very particular or emphasize or criticizing, party lines. You work with the Democrats, you have Democrat friends, I was so amazed. I said, wow, where did that come from? Now I know it's from, biblical worldview. So you have a big heart. So basically what I want to ask you is that, how do you see in the future, if Christians work together, if, biblical worldview is grounded in the Christian community, do America has a hope for the healing, for the coming together?
Right, right. Well, Abraham Lincoln used to refer to America as an experiment, and that it's an experiment in liberty. What will America do with the liberty? In the preamble to the Constitution, there's a statement about working for a more perfect union, okay? And America has never had a perfect union, but America that at its beginning was predominantly 95% biblical worldview, and there were some deists and some others that were, did not have a biblical worldview, but the laws by and large are grounded in a biblical worldview. Well, as the biblical worldview began to erode in the lives of individuals and from generation to generation, and the naturalistic worldview came up in ascendancy, well, we're now seeing the division very, very carefully. And as I stated before, it's not Democrat or Republican, it's a matter of the ideas, it's a clash of ideas. So in terms of America being united, America can become more united and can have a more perfect union, and it is providing that there are more and more people that are moving toward a biblical worldview. The naturalistic worldview is very dominant, and it tries to cancel out, and that's a term that's become very popular, any other worldview. It doesn't want any other worldview, and this is one of the things that demonstrates and proves the point that naturalism is a religion, because not only is the Jewish God jealous, well, the naturalistic faith system is also jealous, and it doesn't want any competition. And so what happens is they want to silence everybody that does not agree with the naturalistic worldview, very much like what happens in China, very much like what happens in Cuba and former Soviet Union, that if you're not in line with the naturalistic worldview, they're going to pull you off the internet platform, or they're going to burn your books or tear down your library. That it is a battle of ideas. So, but the hope is in Christians first, capturing a biblical worldview, stating it clearly, putting it out there, engaging people, speaking the truth in love and graciousness and in humility, and winning the minds where people think to a biblical worldview, encouraging them to make a decision in the heart where humans decide. Then we'll see a change in the behavior. All too often, Christians are more concerned about behavior as opposed to the mind and the heart. And Jesus tells us we need to be more concerned about the internals than the externals. So Isaiah 40, the prophet Isaiah, the Lord reveals through him that the nations are as but dust in the balance. And he says, no sooner are they planted, no sooner they grow, that he blows on them and they wither. Only God is eternal. Every nation is going to have a lifespan, and that's going to be true about America. If it's going to be a long time before Jesus comes, there's going to be a time in the history of the world where the nation of America as we know it now is not going to exist. And the same thing is true about ancient China. Ancient China no longer exists. There's a new China that is there. So nations come and go, and no nation is forever. Only God is forever. And however, we still have, as Christians, the dominion mandate to proclaim the truth and love of the Lordship of Jesus and win people over and do all we can to ensure justice and domestic tranquility and love and peace between neighbors.